of. Thank you. Recording in progress, as it says. And he will speak about the new guidelines on ecological connectivity. Over to you, Gary.
Thank you all. I'm just sharing my screen here. All right, can you see the first slide, Nature Undivided? The first issue of connectivity is being able to hear me and be connected to me. If you are not already, could you please put yourself on mute? I hear someone who's not on mute. It would be very distracting. So this is our goal. This is our goal, Nature Undivided. However, we live in a very fragmented world. In fact, if you believe this study, more than 50% of the terrestrial realm is already fragmented. Roads are the big fragmenting force. In fact, every road, every paved road, asphalt road, tarmac road, no matter what you call it, will double in the next 25 to 30 years based on projections. And certainly roads are a big part of the post-COVID economic stimulus package that's being talked about for around the world. What people aren't paying attention to roads, as we talk about poaching a lot in conservation, is the direct mortality roads have on all species. And for large mammals, the low estimate is that 100 million large mammals are killed every year by the side of the road. And in some places, these are very endangered. If you look at Tasmania, about 600 Tasmanian devils are killed by the side of the road every year. And most of us would talk about the two forms of transmissible cancers that they have.
100 million species killed on our roads every year. And
please put yourself on mute, Andrew. You know, of course, fragmentation also even affects our own health. We certainly know that fragmentation has led to some of the recent pandemics, including the background of what it presented as a cause for the recent COVID-19 epidemic. Now, I live in Bozeman, Montana, about an hour outside of Yellowstone National Park, the world's first national park. And what no one remembers is that this park is literally a box. Protected areas have been the cornerstone of conservation since their beginning, since 1872. But really, boxes are not really ideal for protecting the ecological processes that they're meant to conserve. And if you put collars on the major migration route of a large elk, a large deer, that's inside Yellowstone Park, you'll find that those animals do not pay attention to the box. They roam widely, and the box isn't big enough for their own life histories. Another park north is Glacier National Park, and that's called Glacier International Peace Park. It's actually the first international peace park on the US-Canadian border. And if you look at connectivity in this area, you'll see that protected areas may be the heart, the lungs, the organs of nature. We've been doing a poor job of protecting the circulatory system of nature that connects these parks to their wider landscapes or seascapes. And that's why in this century, the 21st century, we're moving from parks of the 19th century where conservation happens on all lands and waters. And in fact, that's why we have to pay more attention to what's called the ecological matrix, those landscapes and seascapes outside of protected areas, because this is the time where we're trying to conserve not only the habitat in parks, but the ecological functions that these parks serve as core areas to sustain the biosphere and landscapes that surround them. And what I mean by the ecological functions, everything from migration to pollination to the resilience that we have to climate change. So basically, for a lot of folks, connectivity, better connected is more effective. I mean, if you just want to boil it down to that. And for a lot of folks, when they think of connectivity, they think mainly about species movement, but connectivity is so much more than just species movement. It's also about maintaining the dynamic ecological processes that sustain nature. And connectivity is not just in the terrestrial realm. In fact, when you think about connectivity, and we should start thinking about connectivity more deeply in the marine sector, where connectivity is really a three-dimensional kind of construct. And then the real rubber hits the road, if you will, in connectivities in freshwater systems. And if you're paying attention, most of our big freshwater systems around the world suffer from disconnectivity, which is really a huge global issue. But frankly, why connectivity is now rising in the ranks of importance is because where the climate agenda and the biodiversity agendas meet. Because connectivity is where you have the resilience to the changing environmental conditions for species to essentially respond to these environmental changes. And that's why, and it's amazing that one of the first call to actions on connectivity conservation came out of the business community that said that the lack of connectivity was undermining sustainable forestry and agriculture. The very livelihood and fabric of nature that supports human productivity was fraying. But we know that connectivity science has been, around for 60, 70 years. The metapopulation studies, the island biogeography, but it isn't since the millennium, in the year 2000, that we've seen this takeoff, this mainstreaming of connectivity into conservation practice and policy. And in fact, all continents are showing this now exponential growth. And you may ask, well, why is Oceania so low? It's because Australia, for the past several decades, has had regressive governments that have not allowed policy for connectivity to take hold. And even in Canada recently, they've just done a survey of all the ecological connectivity projects across Canada as part of their new Pathway to Target 1 policy program. And you can see the publications are mirrored by this growth as well, if you look on the left-hand side. And just literally in the last 3 weeks, we've seen some major policy announcements on connectivity. The G7 in the UK had it all over their protected area strategy, that it's not just about protected areas, it's about well-connected, connected protected areas. And there was the first ever UN General Assembly resolution on connectivity, Nature Knows No Borders, that was unanimously supported. And now countries all over the world are creating their own connectivity policies and responding. And now we're in this conversation with the Convention on Biological Diversity of enhancing or creating more ambitious conservation targets, the 30 by 30. Now, if you look at this Earth, we've mapped the current protected areas, terrestrial protected areas, and that's 15.4%. Now we can increase those in size, but the problem is we'll still have these islands of hope separate, surrounded by desperation. And what we need to address the effectiveness of these protected areas is by having them more connected. So 4 years ago, IUCN helped create the Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group. We're now about 1,000 members in 125 countries around the world. And we were asked to provide some guidance for this growing realm of connectivity conservation. What is needed is consistent practice and measurable targets. How do we know we're improving if we don't measure what we're doing? It's now in French and Spanish. Now, these guidelines were a global effort. And it's been decades that IUCN's been talking about connectivity, but in the last 5 years, I've had to corral folks in 6 continents with 16 core authors and about 38 case study authors and 150 consulting contributions to this work. We involved as many people as we could. We're sorry we couldn't reach to everyone, but it was a massive process. And we created this first standard, if you will, for ecological connectivity. And let me just walk you through the document, at a high level so you know what's in it. One is that we had to make the case for what connectivity, why there is a need. For so many people, this was a new field. They thought of connectivity as their cell phone coverage. The second was trying to get to all the science that's out there, and the science is overwhelming. I mean, it's coming in daily, how much science is out there. This is just a shout out to this current project that NERC and NSF are doing as a global study of docorridorswork.com, who are looking at corridors in situ around the world. We also had to deal with all the language around connectivity conservation. I mean, just in English, the terminology, the different approaches, they all had to be crosswalked. It was, and it all had to be defined in one simple way. So we created 2 definitions, one for policymakers and one for scientists. And they could not agree to have each of them represent the definition for each other. The policymakers, which was adopted by the Convention on Migratory Species, is that ecological connectivity is the unimpeded movement of species That's for the species part, and the flow of natural processes that sustain life on Earth. Now, the scientists had to say the same thing, but they added things like propagules and gametes and populations and ecosystems. But basically, we're appealing to both audiences. Here's the crux of the document. While we have designated conservation, spatially designated conservation areas called protected areas, and now OECMs, other conserved conservation measures, other effective conservation measures, or conserved areas, coming in as our stalwart pillars of conservation, we have nothing that connects them. And that's why we've come up with this term, this more inclusive term called ecological corridor, which essentially is the Lego block that connects protected areas and OECMs. Now, while protected areas and OECMs have to conserve biodiversity, they don't necessarily have to conserve connectivity, while some do. But ecological corridors do not have to conserve all biodiversity, but they have to conserve the connectivity that we value. And that depends on the context of the landscape or seascape. So the principal recommendation, one of the principal recommendations, is this definition for an ecological corridor as this third building block that should be enshrined in law and policy at regional, national, and subnational scales. Why is this important? Because the countermeasure to fragmentation is building ecological networks, connecting the bits. So we need these designations to connect the protected areas. And this is our conceptual model. And it happens across lands, freshwater, marine, and even airspaces if we can be done. So having these corridors make up ecological networks. And ecological networks can take conservation at scale. We can go from local connectedness all the way to continental conservation. And it can happen in the Albertine Rift, where this is going on, in East Africa, Yellowstone to Yukon in North America, the Great Eastern Ranges in Australia. This is happening in hundreds of landscapes now. This is the conservation movement that's not being paid attention to. It's bottom up. So part of our document was the how-to. How do you look at tenure, governance? What are the mechanisms, the strategy for conservation, the incentives? This is not just about designation. This is about how you deal with covenants, voluntary landowner agreements, conservancies. This is the new realm of conservation. This is the art of conservation. And we wanted to remind folks in chapter 6 that this happens across realms, across marine, terrestrial, coastal, freshwater, airspaces. And that these kind of guidelines or supportive guidelines should be enshrined in all the international environmental agreements. And they are. If you look at the UN Decade of Ecological Restoration, the new strategic plan for the Convention of Migratory Species, the post-2020 framework for biodiversity, they all have connectivity as rising as part of their strategies to achieve their goals. And finally, we had to make a case for how this is going to be measured. We've been working with UNEP, WCMC to create a new database. We know about the World Database for Protected Areas, but we now have to have a World Database for spatially explicit areas for conservation commitment. These areas are not protected areas that we want to map. These areas are area-based commitments. And we have to add that to understand the extent and depth of conservation protected around the globe, especially as we want these more ambitious, high ambitious targets. Now, what we didn't cover in the document was infrastructure and linear infrastructure. And we're going to have the next report coming out in 2022 specifically on how do we green or deal with the growth of linear infrastructure. So stay tuned. So finally, when you look at connectivity in any language, it's the safety net for nature. And we have to start applying ourselves to doing better and measuring better our work in improving this conservation, emergent conservation practice. So I want to thank you all for inviting me today. You can learn more. On the top left-hand corner is the email address, is the link to the connectivity guidelines. And thank you all for your support and all the great science and practice that's come out of the UK.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gary. That was a whirlwind tour through such an important area. And how we're going to run this is that we'd like to take questions as we go along in terms of gathering them in the chat, but then we want to put them to particular panelists, or indeed to a whole panel at the end. We've just enabled the chat, so you should be able to do that. If you feel your question relates to something that Gary has said, then please do put for Gary and then put the question in. And as we move through the other speakers, if you have particular questions for them, and we'll be picking them up and then asking you to ask them at the end, when hopefully you're still here and still connected. So fantastic. So now we're moving on to the national level of thinking about, well, how do we do this? We've had this fantastic sort of international framework for looking at ecological connectivity. Now Humphrey Crick, who is Principal Specialist in Conservation Ecology for Natural England, which is the government's advisor for the environment in England, is going to talk about actually how do we plan that connectivity in England's highly fragmented landscape. And I gather you've been asked to have a little nod towards beyond England, but you may not be able to do that. So we'll all be looking out for those nods. And thank you, Humphrey, over to you.
Thanks, Pamela. That's really kind. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, right. Coming from Natural England, I will, as Pamela says, mainly probably be talking about England, because that's what I know best, obviously. But I will mention what's going on in other parts of the UK as well. And I will be talking quite generally, so it should be relevant to the rest of the UK. So we've, Gary's just given us a great outline of the new IUCN guidelines on connectivity. And I hope to, as Pamela says, bring this a bit closer to home in terms of the UK to show about how we're thinking about connectivity here. The concept of networks for nature and people has become really widespread throughout the UK. Some elements are still in prep. For example, the Environment Bill is still going through Parliament at the moment in England, and there are various strategies in development in Northern Ireland. But it is really well embedded in mainstream thinking of government here now, and indeed within the environmental NGO communities as well. For example, the concepts of living landscapes that the wildlife trusts have developed. And all of these have connectivity as a key element. The trouble is that although the concept of connectivity seems very obvious as to what it means, it actually can be quite a tricky concept, both in theory and practice. So I'll describe how we're tackling this in England, but many of the same sorts of thinking are also happening in the rest of the UK. The forthcoming Environment Bill that's going through Parliament at the moment, which should be amazing actually, has its origins in the government's white paper, the 25-year Environment Plan. And it had, the government's ambition is to leave our environment in a better state than we found it, which I don't think anybody could quibble with. Sounds like well, it's absolutely essential. And the plan will deliver cleaner air and water in our cities and rural landscapes. It will protect threatened species, provide richer wildlife habitats, and it calls for an approach to agriculture, forestry, land use, and fishing that puts the environment first. And some of the things that it wants to do, particularly with regard to nature, is to create 500,000 hectares of new priority habitat, develop a nature recovery network, which will be very much built up from local thinking based on local nature recovery strategies at the sort of county level. Wants to establish 25 new catchment or landscape scale nature recovery areas, which will be big, to significantly expand wildlife habitat. And it also includes a heck of a lot of tree planting. For example, it wants to develop a new northern forest. So the nature recovery network is where connectivity really comes in. But one could ask just very briefly, why do we need one? Well, back in 2010, there was a really good review led by Professor Sir John Lawton on our protected area network. And they concluded pretty unequivocally that our protected areas do not comprise a coherent and resilient ecological network. So resilient, obviously, in terms of climate change, it wasn't going to help our species cope with climate change and other environmental pressures. But coherent is one of those interesting terms that is used quite a lot. And it really means that the network has to have all the elements necessary to achieve its overall objectives. And the components of the network should be chosen to be complementary and mutually reinforcing. So 3 aspects. One is that the network should be representative of all the wildlife within the country. It should be adequate. Adequate sounds a bit mean, sort of measly, I guess, but it really means that the network is able to is sufficient to allow species to be self-sustaining in the long term. So it has to provide everything that species need and for them to maintain themselves. And finally, it needs to be connected. It needs to ensure connectivity. The problem is particularly acute in England. I sort of feel jealous of Gary and the huge amounts of wilderness that he's able to deal with. But in England, we really do have a heavily fragmented landscape. And this heavily fragmented landscape and weak protected area network make England's biodiversity and ecosystems particularly vulnerable to the additional stresses that you might get from things like climate change, and is one of the reasons why our biodiversity has continued to decline over recent years, despite some notable successes. I mean, for example, going for a walk yesterday, actually we saw red kites overhead, which I live in East Anglia, and that would have been unheard of 15 years ago. So we're quite good at some things, but overall, we need a new and different way of thinking about things. And this is where the Nature Recovery Network should come in. So we have to think of networks, and this was a great diagram. It's almost iconic, actually, coming out of the Lawton report to show what the main elements of a coherent ecological network should be. So we need core areas of high quality habitat with buffer zones around them, connected by corridors or stepping stones. And also you need to remember the sort of green area all around it, which is the matrix. And Gary talked about the matrix quite a lot. So that intervening landscape, which is really important. The Lawton report came up with a brilliant mantra, which is better, bigger, more, and joined. And what they said was, and people can remember this, it's great. So what they said was, we need to make our protected sites better, we need to make them bigger, we need more of them, and we need to join them up. So in our landscape, you know, a lot of it is intensively farmed, and England, 70% of the land is farmland. And we need to think about how we're going to join up, you know, allow things to move between little patches of habitat within the landscape going across. And in fact, we really need to think about a lot of populations at a local level or sort of regional level as a series of interconnected populations that are mutually reinforcing. Essentially, they are what are called metapopulations. So if a population goes extinct in one patch, it should be recolonized and then be there to help another patch if they go extinct at some other point. So if we're thinking about metapopulations at a local level with movement between sites, then there is an additional, which is quite rather different sort of connectivity, which is to do with long distance movements. And these really depend on the quality of the source and the receptor sites to generate enough propagules, as it were, colonists to move from one site to another. So the source site needs to be really good quality to produce a sort of abundance of wildlife, so that they chucks out colonists, which will eventually find some really good sites elsewhere. We don't necessarily have to think of networks as being sort of superhighways. Dispersal is quite a crucial parameter for genetic purposes. One actually only needs, in natterjack toads, an example from Stevenson Baguette in 2008 says that you barely need one dispersing individual to rescue declining local populations. So for genetic purposes, something like 1 to 10 migrants per generation is a good rule of thumb. And also for long distance dispersal, it's only a small number of individuals that go really long distance. And you can see from this information from the BTO, British Trust for Ornithology, they're ringing data of movements of song thrushes from when they leave the nest to where they breed in the following year. You can see, and it's a log scale on the y-axis. So the vast majority of song thrushes only stay within the 5 kilometers of where they were born. But there's this very small number which will go very long distances. And it's very important to increase the population and productivity of your source habitats in order to have sufficient numbers of individuals going those longer distances. So in terms of connectivity, Lawton's better and bigger really help with the concept of longer distance connectivity. And the more and joined really reflect and think about the shorter distance connectivity. So we're thinking about corridors, stepping stones, and matrix permeability. The trouble with the Lawton report, brilliant as it was, is that it didn't really tell practitioners how to make sites better, how much bigger they should be, how many more do we need and where should we put them, and what are the best ways to join things up. So we did a bit of a literature review, which is really relevant to UK and probably parts of Europe, to look at all the evidence to do with those sorts of aspects. And we produced a Nature Networks evidence handbook and also a quick start guide, a sort of summary with all the best bits in for people who didn't want to wade through all the results. And this is being used quite widely, I think, and it's going to be part of our Nature Recovery Network toolkit that DEFRA, our Department of Environment, and Natural England are putting together, and also for local nature recovery strategy areas. Now, one of the things I was really keen on doing was to try and boil everything down to one page, because I thought that'd be a great challenge, but also I wanted practitioners not to have to wade through all this stuff. They can go back and check it out if they query something, but I wanted them to have everything on one page to do with the ecological side of ecological networks. And so this is what we did. And we stuck our neck out as well by actually putting numbers in places, which probably annoy almost everybody. But on the other hand, they probably won't be too far wrong in most cases. So I'm going to just try and walk you through them a little bit. So what do we think about sites that should be better? Well, we came up with our own little mantra, which was better sites should be big enough, messy, complex, and dynamic. So big enough is really where we, and Gary talked about this, starting to think about natural ecosystem functioning and ecosystem units, really, functional units. So if you've got a wetland site, you've got to be thinking about the surrounding hydrology, because that will affect your site. There's no point in just drawing a line around the lake, for example. You need to know what's happening with the ecology, the hydrology. And for other areas, you need to know about what is influencing. Is there enough for species to be self-sustaining and so on? So that's one aspect. Then we talked about being structurally messy. Most species don't just live in one habitat, but use a variety of habitats. So you ideally want these big enough sites to be also kind of a mosaic of a range of different habitats, which species can use over the course of their life cycle. Then we want things to be biologically complex. We want full food web, food webs, and a whole range of trophic levels in there, because that will help ensure resilience and make the sites function better. And finally, we need to think about dynamism. Ecosystems are naturally dynamic, and for too long, a lot of conservation has been trying to sort of hold back the sea, as it were, to stop change. Whereas we ought to, if we got big enough sites, we can encourage change, we can encourage dynamism, succession, and so on the basis that it will gradually move around in different parts of the sites. Ecological engineers can be very good at helping this, and in Britain now, we've discovered the joys of beavers, which are everybody beginning to appreciate now, and they're great examples of ecosystem engineers. But you can have small species as well. I mean, woodpeckers create sites for for other species. Sphagnum moss, for example, creates its own ecosystem. So that is also an ecosystem engineer. So that's better. Well, how big should a site be? Well, that's really quite difficult. Reviewing the literature for the UK and close by Europe, we found that overall, we would suggest that sites should be around 40 hectares in size, preferably up greater than 100 hectares. And that would be insufficient to allow most groups of species to have self-sustaining populations, probably within a metapopulation. So we've stuck our neck out there, but and small sites can be really useful. But if you're, as a conservation practitioner, thinking about designating a new site, then think about 40 hectares, because that's you're not going to lose anything, and it could be a really good benefit for the species. And then thinking about movements, stepping stones allow, these are small patches of suitable habitat that allow species to move from one bigger core patch to another. And we suggested that actually for highly specialized species that aren't very good at moving around, these stepping stones need to be really within 200 meters of each other to allow things to move across. And for more general species, sort of 1 kilometer or 2 is what's necessary for moving if they're really quite restricted to a certain habitat. Softening the matrix is really important, making it more permeable to facilitate the movement of species across the landscape. And this is where our agri-environment schemes can come in. They provide habitat, resources for wildlife, and the connections. One other aspect that we realized was that we developed a general rule of thumb to suggest that if you've got something like 20% cover of semi-natural habitat in an area, that's going to really encourage general connectivity and resilience of populations in that area. So that's quite a neat rule of thumb to be thinking about in terms of how much semi-natural habitat you have in an area. And then we've got corridors. Now corridors, big question is, well, how wide should our corridor be? Well, you know, for some species, they don't actually need very much. And there have been studies to show that something like a vole will be quite happy with 1 meter wide. So hedgerows and things can act as useful corridors. But if you're thinking a bit more generally, for things that actually need to live in corridors while they're moving along them, as it were, you ought to think about the home range width that these types of species have. And although corridors need to be, in a way, designed with types of species in mind, we decided on came up with a rule of thumb that they need to be at least 100 meters wide, and preferably something like 350 meters wide. And also natural corridors are more effective than human designed ones. So it's always a good idea to make use of the natural habitats or natural corridors that you've got in your area. We've been developing some tools to try and help people think about nature networks in natural England. And one of them is a habitat network map that's been developed by a group of my colleagues. And this shows for a range of priority habitats that we have, where they are, what associated habitats there are, how they link with areas which would be suitable for habitat creation. So these are the sort of darker brown areas based on the soil types and so on. And also identify some areas which would be very good for creating connectivity between closely adjacent patches. So that's all available on our website. And another tool to think about more long distance connectivity, which is we found useful, is one called Condartis, which is being developed by Jenny Hodgson and colleagues up at the University of Liverpool. And this thinks of species as electrons moving across an electric circuit. And so, for example, here you've got thinking about a species moving from the south coast up to the Scottish border across calcareous grassland. And you can see that immediately there are some really highlighted areas of important connectivity, which will be important for local nature recovery strategy people to know about, because they may unwittingly have a very important area for national connectivity, and this sort of analysis can help illuminate that. It can also show where there are bottlenecks which require new habitat to be created. So in conclusion, the UK really does suffer from highly fragmented landscapes, and connectivity is a really important consideration. The Lawton principles still hold good, but we've helped to refine them a little bit, and we've created these rules of thumb to help cut through the massive evidence that's available. And there are some useful tools out there. But I reckon that in our sort of situation, the core patches are really important for increasing and helping long distance movement, increasing the sort of propagule pressure, the colonist pressure, by chucking out lots of colonists from really good, big, better sites. And then the matrix is very important for supporting more local connectivity and metapopulation. So things like stepping stones and general habitat permeability is also very important. So thinking about that local connectivity, I'm looking forward to hearing our next talk from our colleagues in Somerset, who are going to tell us a bit about a much more local area of looking. So back to you, Pamela.
Brilliant, thank you, Humphrey. It's wonderful to hear almost the words that I don't know how many of you who are old enough to have heard about trophic levels and food webs at school, and then we went away from that and we made it really, really complicated. And it's really brilliant to see Natural England kind of bringing it round and speaking in a language as well as having the science and the complexity, but actually in a language that people can grasp and can take into action. So that's fantastic. Thank you very much. So we are now, we're noticing as well questions in the chat, and we're picking those up. We do tend to find at these kind of things that we don't often get as many women asking questions, or those who identify as men asking questions. So if you would like to ask a question, whoever you are, please do so. If you feel a little bit shy about your question, and I have to say this is quite often me, and then somebody else asks it, and then somebody else, the chair says, that's an amazing question, thank you so much. And I think in my heart, that was too shy. So you can just pop it to me if you would like, or to Chris, who is down as the host, so here at the top of your chat. If you kind of would just like one of us to ask the question for you. And there's no stupid question. All questions are valid, and we would really like to kind of have questions from the diversity of the people that we see before us. So now we're going to move on from the sort of the theoretical frameworks which Natural England and IUCN are creating, and some of the examples of where they're creating it, to nature recovery in action, with two speakers from Somerset Wildlife Trust. We have Anne Halpin, who is the lead monitoring and management planning ecologist. Have I said all of those words in the right order? Quite possibly. And Simon Clarke, who is Somerset Wildlife Trust's head of nature recovery, and who is coordinating the delivery of the local partnerships. And just as a moment, for those of you who are not perhaps familiar with the Wildlife Trust's movement, there are 46 wildlife trusts. The majority are in England, but there are 5 in Wales, 1 for the whole of Scotland, 1 for Northern Ireland, and 2 in the Crown dependencies, 1 for Alderney and 1 for the Isle of Man. And they all join together under the banner of they're all members of the Royal Society of Wildlife Trusts. And as a collective voice are represented by the wildlife trusts, in the UK and at England level, to kind of lead the development of the movement and to advocate for wildlife together. So I'm going to hand over, first of all, I think it's I see it's Simon then Anne at this point. Is it Simon then Anne this time? Because it was going to be Anne, Simon.
Yeah, no, we're going to do a double act, Pamela. So I'm going to just do a quick introduction and then I'm going to hand over to Anne. Okay.
I will leave it to you, and do continue to ask questions, everyone.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Pamela. Hopefully you can all see that slide there. So my name's Simon Clarke. I'm head of nature recovery at Somerset Wildlife Trust. I've been with the Wildlife Trust for 18 months, and prior to that, I actually worked with Humphrey and Pamela and others for Natural England for 12 years. So I'm a nature reserve manager in background. In a moment, I'm just going to introduce you to Anne Halpin, who's our brilliant monitoring ecologist at Somerset Wildlife Trust. We're going to do a bit of a double up today, just talking about the ecological and nature recovery network work that we are doing in Somerset, but we're also going to talk about some of those really good on the ground examples that we've got locally to sort of demonstrate how connectivity is working within the county. Just as a really quick introduction, Somerset Wildlife Trust, it's actually not far from its 60th anniversary in a couple of years' time. Set up in 1964, and we are Somerset's leading environmental charity with over 21,000 members, and we're proud to be able to represent the wider wildlife trust movement today. We manage 1,700 hectares of nature reserves across the county, and really excitingly, we've just launched our new strategy, Wilder Somerset 2030, and we'll talk around these goals a bit more as we go through the presentation. But as you'll see, it's about really restoring nature across the county. We have a target for restoring 30% of Somerset for nature, and ecological connectivity is going to be a huge part of that by 2030. Also, that we want to get 1 in 4 people actually taking part in nature recovery. The key to nature recovering and addressing the climate change emergency is to get people to value their natural world and appreciate what they've got around them. And then we're also going to tell Somerset's story. So this is something about the Somerset state of nature, and actually so we can actually monitor and record and show how nature is recovering over the next 10 years. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Anne.
Thank you. So why are we here? Well, I think we all know why we're here. Over the past few decades, we've become increasingly aware that the protectionist model of site-based conservation isn't working. And in 2010, when that Making Space for Nature review came out, Professor John Lawton explicitly stated that conservation in Britain has failed. Next, he said that having carefully examined the evidence, we've concluded that England's collection of wildlife sites, diverse as it is, does not comprise a coherent and resilient ecological network. And they went on to say that it will require a step change in behaviour from one in which we basically try to hang on to what remains to one of large-scale habitat restoration and recreation to make space for nature. Next, please. So what have the Wildlife Trust been doing? Well, we have known for a long time that whilst nature reserves are critical for safeguarding wildlife, the long-term protection of these often isolated fragments of wild places is not enough. So for the past 15 years, we've been working on the approach called living landscapes. And in Somerset, we have the second oldest living landscape project in the country, the Mendip Hills Living Landscape, and that runs alongside 3 others within the county. And some of the key principles of these models are that we focus on people and local communities. We want to achieve sustainable local economies. We know that good spatial planning is critical, but we also have to be practical, and delivery is often through partnership and collaboration. We monitor and evaluate what we've achieved, and we really want to sustain that effort over the long term. But we really know that integrating site-based conservation into a landscape scale working, this is nothing new to us. Next, please. So how did we develop our ecological networks model? Well, at about the same time as the Lawton Review, we were in discussions with Somerset County Council and Aggregate Industries about a Section 106 agreement. Now, this is a legal agreement between the local authority and a developer or a company, and it's related in this case to the planned expansion of the Tor Works quarry in East Mendip. And this led in 2013 to the Tor Works Environmental Enhancement Fund. It's now been rebranded as Mendip Wildlife Links, and it focuses on the eastern part of the Mendip Hills close to the quarry. And this fund brought in a significant amount of officer time, which enabled us to survey and map over 1,000 hectares. We classified it using the integrated habitat system. And we then worked with Forest Research and the County Council to develop our ecological network model, which is based on the Beetle model. We also developed the BioCore tool to evaluate the coherence and the resilience of the networks and identify potential restoration areas. So after 8 years of a 10-year project fund, the project really has demonstrated how ecological network mapping can be successfully used to target delivery. Next, please. But just to remind everyone what ecological networks actually are, they are a coherent system of natural or semi-natural landscape elements that is configured and managed with the objective of maintaining or restoring ecological functions as a means to conserve biodiversity. What we know is that ecological networks, Somerset ecological network maps, what they represent are just fragments of what was once a much larger network. We also know that they are both the precursor to and an integral part of a nature recovery network. Next, please. And this is what they look like on a county scale. And what often strikes me when I look at these maps is just how much white space there is, how small those areas of high quality species rich habitats actually are. These areas represent somewhere in the region of 10% of the county. So to get to 30%, we've got a huge job ahead of us. But what we also need to remember is that these maps represent the most species rich habitats. And it doesn't mean that there's no wildlife elsewhere. To me, this really highlights that we need to go beyond the boundaries of nature reserves and look at how we can restore wildlife at a landscape scale. But how do we go from ecological networks mapping to a nature recovery network? Next, please. So to start with, we were very lucky that in 2005, a group called the Biodiversity Southwest Partnership did quite a lot of work producing a detailed map of landscape scale opportunities for the maintenance, restoration, and expansion of key species-rich habitats. So a lot of that work had already been done for us. Next, please. So what we really wanted to do was bring this data up to date. We had to refine the data layer, eliminate overlaps, add detail, and fill in gaps so that we could create a single seamless layer for the whole county with a detailed table of contents. We referenced lots of data sets, including things like flood zones, designated sites, urban areas, and underlying geology. We used our most up-to-date ecological network maps to make sure that each of our zones and the habitats they recommended restoring were appropriate. And we looked at what other organizations were doing. For example, BugLife, the invertebrate conservation charity, they were drawing up their Somerset section of their national beelines network at about this time. And this is a network of species-rich corridors that spans the whole of Britain, moving from a north-south and an east-west directions. So it really tied in nicely with what we were doing. Next, please. So after all of that, we went through a few rounds of consultation and refinement, and we produced this map, which is our nature recovery zones for Somerset. But this by itself doesn't make a nature recovery network. It shows us what is desirable on a county-wide scale in terms of habitat restoration. But when you zoom in, you still need more detail. So what we really want to do is create a package of layers that allow planners, developers, and project managers to make targeted decisions about where to locate restoration or mitigation projects. Next, please. We want to produce a package that includes a prioritized list of habitats for each zone. For example, here on the Mendip Scarp, what we would really like to see is more limestone grassland. We also want to see something called limestone heath, which is an unusual habitat found on the Mendip Hills. But we also want to see elsewhere mosaics of grasslands with scrub, woodland, and other habitats. We want to create detailed maps for the zones that show ecological networks, so what exists currently, but also the outputs of biocore that will show us potential restoration zones, really critical places for expanding the ecological network. We're working at creating ecosystem services maps, and these will really show where opportunities exist that will tie into new funding streams. Things like carbon sequestration, flood alleviation, or phosphate mitigation provide opportunities for project funding. And we're also starting to develop what we'll call restoration pathways. And these are pathways that detail the steps required to transition habitats from a low species richness through a series of improving stages to more species rich ones. And this could include everything from small changes within a farmed landscape, such as hedgerow protection, reverting arable to permanent grassland, through things like restoring species-rich grasslands, expanding woodlands, right the way up to large-scale rewilding projects, which may well be possible in some parts of Somerset. The key here is that the detailed spatial data allows work to be properly planned so that our ecological networks can become bigger, better, and more connected. Next slide, please. And a lot of this data is already in use. Our ecological network maps are being used at both the strategic and development planning stages. And since 2015, all Somerset's local planning authorities have had access to the ecological networks and GIS layers, sorry, our report and our GIS layers, through a service level agreement with the Somerset Environmental Record Centre. They've been used in our local plans. The mineral plan, Somerset's mineral plan 2015, was the first in the country to reference our ecological networks. And since 2018, the ecological network data has been available through the Somerset Environmental Record Centre as a data search. And now we're going to be working with partners to develop these data sets further and to develop projects that are really needed to actually deliver a nature recovery network. And on that note, I'm going to pass back to Simon so he can tell you more about those.
Thanks, Anne, that's brilliant, thank you. So yeah, just to quickly take you back to the very beginning of our presentation, and these are the goals of the Wildlife Trust in our new strategy. Number one is to make more space for nature, that nature is improving everywhere. We've restored natural processes with at least 30% of land and sea positively managed for wildlife. Through our data with Somerset Environmental Record Centre, we know that about 10% of Somerset is in what we might call a good natural condition at the moment. And through our work with the local nature partnership, we are going to be coordinating the delivery of the local nature recovery strategy for Somerset. And that will feed into the bigger nature recovery network that Humphrey was talking about earlier. Again, it's about trying to get as many people involved in the movement for nature conservation as we can. So our goal is to get 1 in 4 people actively taking part in positive action for nature's recovery. And that involves stakeholders at a regional level, right down to local communities and groups. So it's right throughout society. And then it's about embedding data and embedding an understanding of how the environment is doing. So telling Somerset's story, and that will be something called the Live Somerset State of Nature, which would allow us to actually monitor how nature is recovering over the next 10 years. So what are the benefits of having a nature recovery network? There's lots of new funding mechanisms that are coming along at the moment. And by having a nature recovery network, we can actually make the most of those new funding mechanisms. So for example, under the Environment Bill, there's new things like biodiversity net gain, which are being introduced, whereby if any new planning or any new developments take place, they need to actually provide not just mitigation for any damage that might be caused for the natural environment, but actually be able to demonstrate an improvement in that environment. So it allows us to focus things around net gain, and also some of the new sort of funding mechanisms around ELMS, ELMS, or for natural capital services. It allows us to focus those resources in the right places for the benefit of ecology, but also for climate change. So it's about carbon sequestration at a landscape scale. We have to remember that the ecological emergencies and the climate change emergencies aren't isolated, and that a good natural environment can actually help us adapt for climate change as well. And also we need to take into account the health and well-being of our communities, and also engage with landowners and communities. So it's about people as well. And also, I think it's going to get talked about a bit more, but it's also an opportunity for us to shape the future of our economy. We can create a greener and more nature-based economy, which will allow us to thrive into the future. So the key to this is partnership. The key to us making this happen is partnership. So by coordinating the creation of the local nature recovery strategies, we're bringing together a whole range of different bodies and stakeholders from across wildlife and conservation, from business, through planning, through district councils, farming, community groups. We're bringing everybody together because in order for a nature recovery network and a nature recovery strategy to work, it needs to be adapted, and it needs to be owned by all within Somerset. So we're going to be delivering pilot projects and we're going to be using those pilots to demonstrate nature recovery across the county. And again, it's back to data. We need to embed data at the heart of it. We need to make sure that we're monitoring how our habitats and our species are doing, so we can show whether we're actually improving, or where we're not improving, where we need to improve, and where we need to become more focused in our activity. So very, very quickly, just going to bring this to an end. I'm going to talk about two or three really good examples in Somerset. The first thing I'm going to talk about is something on the Mendip Hills, which Anna's already referred to, one of our oldest living landscapes in the country. And we're really proud that we're actually being funded by Natural England to coordinate a farm facilitation fund. And that's working with a group of over 30 farmers on the Mendip Hills to deliver nature conservation work through their stewardship schemes. But also within that, we're embedding our ecological and nature recovery thinking. So actually, when we're working with their farmers, we're actually creating connectivity between land holdings. And we're also looking at how we can increase permeability between the land holdings as well. So it's not just about looking at farms in isolation, it's looking at them in an entirety. We're also working with communities in a whole wide range of ways. This is something that's really, really new. This is something called Wilder Churches. And actually, this was only launched 2 weeks ago by one of our colleagues, Pippa Rayner, and she's doing a fantastic project with the Diocese of Bath and Wells, actually rewilding or renaturing churchyards across the county. And it's looking at a whole variety of communities and species, from mammals, bats, birds, insects, and botanical habitats. And to show how successful that is, on her first presentation on the 24th of May, she had over 200 different communities across Somerset dial into that presentation. And basically we're being overwhelmed by communities that want to get involved. So communities are really interested. Now is the perfect time to be engaging and embedding those things around nature recovery and ecological connectivity across Somerset. And finally, I'm going to talk about one of our successful landscape scale projects in Somerset. This is something called the Avalon Marshes landscape. The Avalon Marshes landscape is a low-lying area of the Somerset levels and moors. It's about 15,000 hectares in size, and basically none of the land is more than a couple of meters above sea level. It's an area that's really, really important for its wetland habitats, and it's also a very, very important landscape because it's mainly peat. It's peat bogs that have been there for thousands of years. There's some real big issues there around drainage for agriculture, and also there's an actually still digging for peat in that landscape. There's been a lot of economic drivers that have led to that activity. So we're working closely with the farmers and also the peat industry in that landscape to try and protect the environment there. But as part of that, one of the big things that came out was about 15, 20 years ago, some of the old peat workings were handed over to the nature conservation organisations, so the precursors to Natural England and some of the NGOs, to recreate wetland habitats. And over the last 15 years, we've been restoring a whole mosaic of different habitats in the county, from reed bed to fens and bogs, wet grasslands and open water habitats. The driver for that and the mechanism for that was through European funding, so something called the EU Life Budget Fund. And that was the main driver for that was a species called the bittern, so a very, very rare type of heron. Back in the mid-80s, there were only 10 booming bitterns, so the male birds left in the whole of the country. So because of the work in this landscape, in 1996, we had our first nest of bittern in the county. And now we have over 42 nests each year within Somerset alone. And we have over a quarter of the booming males in the country, just in the Somerset levels, in an area of about 500 hectares of reed bed. So it shows that by actually having a flagship species and creating habitat, you can do some amazing things to restore nature. But even though the driving force of that was the bittern, other species and other habitats have evolved. So we now know that it's one of the most important parts of the southwest for other bird species, for example, cuckoo, reed bunting, and bearded tit or bearded reedlings like here. and a whole range of other bird species. We know that we get a fantastic array of invertebrates as well. So this is the hairy dragonfly, a whole range of different species of other invertebrates. We've now rediscovered a population. This isn't one of them, but something called the large marsh grasshopper, again, has been recovered in this landscape. And we're now building on that. So using the ecological network mapping, we're actually starting to connect the Avalon Marshes landscape to some of our other nature recovery network areas beyond. So for example, we're moving out to the coast. The big green blob to the left of the screen, that's Bridgewater Bay and Sturt Marshes. We're creating nature recovery networks through there. We're also heading to the south to the Somerset Levels proper, if you want to recall it, for some of the important wetlands there. We're creating nature recovery networks there. We're also moving north, heading up to the Mendip Hills as part of those sort of national networks, things like bee lines and some of those things that Humphrey were talking about, those connectivity landscapes we're connecting there. And we're also heading towards some of our local towns and cities and connecting into those. So for example, we're heading sort of east towards Glastonbury Street. So there's some exciting things happening in Somerset, and they're a sort of reflection of what's happening across the Wildlife Trust landscapes across the England. So I'm going to stop there and hand you back to Pamela. So thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I feel hugely inspired and energized after that romp through all of the things that are happening in Somerset. And as Simon says, that kind of thing is actually happening throughout the Wildlife Trust movement. And my suspicion is that it's happening across the RSPB and all sorts of other landowners and NGOs. Alongside, if anyone has been watching Springwatch, Wild Ken Hill, which has started dipping its toes into the sort of rewilding concept following on from the Knepp estate. So huge amounts happening, and I think a lot happening with some of the science and the evidence behind it in terms of the connectivity, actually looking at the evidence base and seeing where to target future interventions. And that's what feels different about it this time round. And we've got some fantastic questions coming in as well, but we'll crack on with our final speaker before we then end. So Marcelo Lima, who has been working on connectivity conservation for a long time. We worked together on the ULEP WCMC back in the day, and he's now the biodiversity manager at CDP Worldwide. Worldwide, that's the one. And he's going to talk about how companies could include connectivity conservation into their corporate biodiversity action plans. Marcelo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Pamela. Amazing presentation so far, and some really interesting synergies what I'm going to present now, trying to wrap up this session. So as you mentioned, I'm working on CDP, which is an environmental impact NGO. We help companies disclose on their impacts on climate change, water security, deforestation. Now we're looking on how companies might disclose on their biodiversity impacts and help them to find ways to mitigate it. So as you probably can see my screen, hopefully. Is my screen there? Yeah, okay, brilliant. And I also got other hats in here, so I'm basically representing all these so I mean, so one of what we were talking about the last presentation about partnerships and how it's important for you to reach out and find different partners, and one of the partners is obviously the business. And first of all, why should business care about biodiversity? And we're seeing here an interesting example that we're now looking about COVID recovery, but looking at recession, but still looking like climate change. But there's a big thing called biodiversity that is also collapsing. And recently the IPBES, the Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity Ecosystem Services, said basically that we face a planetary emergency. There are more than 1 million plant and animal species that are threatened with extinction. And biodiversity underpins all life on Earth and provides us with much needed ecosystem services, and such as pollination, flood control, clean air, as well as human mental and physical well-being. So the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report in 2020 actually listed biodiversity loss among the top 5 global risks in terms of likelihood in 2020. And impressively, 44 trillion of economic value generation, which is over half of the world's GDP, is moderately or highly dependent on nature and its services, and as a result exposed to risk from nature biodiversity. So there is a case here for businesses to be worried about biodiversity and worried about their impacts. Recently, in 2017, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development made a white paper called Landscape Connectivity, a call for action. And the WBS-CSD has over 200 members and with a combined revenue of $8.5 trillion, which is quite impressive as well. And they listed the key benefits that are directly and indirectly supported for infrastructure and landscape connectivity, and some of them like pest control, pollinator species, soil conservation, water regulation and protection, additional income, brand reputation, increased crop yields and quality, financial gains, license to operate, and property value increase are really of importance to lots of different businesses. Not only businesses, but also to invest capital markets investors and asset managers who have a huge demand from their investors to be investing in companies that are not only climate change friendly, but also now biodiversity friendly. So in this call, there are three key approaches for businesses along with other stakeholders to work with connectivity conservation, and basically the three listed here. We look first at the using marginal land in rural industrial areas, which is quite straightforward. This is land that is not being used or is considered not good for certain crops, or areas that have been abandoned, and they could possibly be used for the creation, for example, of richer habitats in field margins and riparian zones by rivers. Back 25 years ago, I did research in the Amazon and actually looking at land next to riparian streams or riparian areas in an agricultural fields in Amazon, and seeing how they could be used for connectivity conservation. They could also avoid winter flooding of, use winter flooding of rice fields in temperate regions that would create a comprehensive water network. They could also use, for example, tree crops and shade crops to increase landscape permeability. This is one example they use, for example, the cocoa production and they call cocoa shade friendly cocoa production. And also restoring uncropped and abandoned areas that can provide the necessary functional and structural elements for establishing ecological networks. Benefits of this could also include the increased yield of the crops or higher market value and demand as a result of implementing biodiversity measure. This could come along with like certification schemes, for example. Second approach is implementing, supporting, developing initiatives for spatial planning. So this is about incorporating businesses, incorporating in their planning and logistics, organizing where they're going to put their businesses or their plants to use spatial planning. So they really should, the businesses, the stakeholders should really use the tools that are available, and things like IBAT, NCORE, and key biodiversity areas, what have you, that can provide information on how to better use the land and actually maintain or reconnect areas. And also using like connectivity conservation metrics in their spatial planning. Oil and gas, resource extraction, agriculture and construction companies should incorporate fragmentation and mitigation strategies into their planning. Then these can also include certification schemes which award connectivity conservation best practices. So companies should think about the matrix management while doing this spatial planning, and Humphrey mentioned about the matrix. So this is about how do you keep the matrix, which is the predominant area and normally deforested, how can you keep it permeable for certain species? This is interesting and was mentioned by Simon that now currently in England it's mandatory for all developments to demonstrate a 10% increase in biodiversity in or near the developments. And this is really an interesting and opportunity to establish connectivity using spatial planning. So this is about putting biodiversity on the right place and the right elements. So it's not only about generic tree planting, as many developers think is what they have to do, but where they're planting, which can be other things besides trees, can be hedges, can be flowers, can be meadows, can be lots of things depending on where they're doing that. So this is a great opportunity that we have. In third place is introducing green infrastructure in and around urban areas. So this is about the companies really thinking about their construction sites, their plants, and how they can make it greener and help actually increase the green areas. So they could enhance connectivity by integrating their infrastructure into a green network system. For example, the EU strategy on green infrastructure and the urban infrastructure. This benefits could include from this lower operation costs, higher building value, and lower lifetime costs. And green urban infrastructure can create alternative routes between disconnected natural ecosystems. Abandoned and unused spaces can be transformed in urban gardens, acting as corridors and stepping stones, for example. So what are the next steps here? So one of the things that we've been looking at in CDP in a project along with BNP Paribas Asset Management is how companies should really try to establish for example, a corporate biodiversity strategy. And so we all should raise the awareness of the corporate sectors about the benefits of investing in connectivity conservation, and encourage the companies to include landscape level planning and implementation, as well as encourage the use of marginal land in agriculture and urban landscapes, and encourage companies to align the science-based targets for nature, which is a great initiative, which has been developed by the Science-Based Targets Network. So the corporate sector should really disclose their biodiversity impact, be it negative or positive, including how they affect connectivity and how they're mitigating their impact. For this, simple connectivity conservation metrics maybe could be helpful. Following this, so we're talking about the guidelines for conservation connectivity here, but there's also an interesting guideline that just came out from IUCN, which are the guidelines for planning and monitoring corporate biodiversity performance. And this is really how you change, I think, the thinking in businesses, because you make the businesses think about their priorities, their ambitions, their indicators, and how they're going to implement the measures that will mitigate their impact. And all this is very similar to, for example, risk management framework, or to product development. So companies will feel more comfortable in using these schemes. And that's basically it from me. Hopefully it gives you a bit broad insight about how companies can engage with connectivity conservation.
Fantastic. Thank you, Marcelo. And thank you to all our speakers. And I just realized by Diego talking in the chat there, we have 3/4 of the Cambridge Corncrakes band, the conservation band. So there's another element of connectivity added to our conversation today. So the questions are, I think, still coming in, but I just wondered if we could, if I just ask somebody to ask your question, and then whoever is the panelist can respond to it. They're clustering slightly around monitoring, around funding, and around the risks almost of too much connectivity, and then another sort of looking out towards the marine as well. And I just wondered if we wanted to start rather controversially with a question from, I'm not sure quite who it is, but it's NHY 440. Around the risks of too much connectivity, which I think was a question for Gary. Would you like to unmute and ask that if you're still on?
Yes, hi, that was me. I don't know quite why I can present NH5440, that's the university.
Would you like to introduce your actual name?
Yes, I'm Justin Travis from the University of Aberdeen. So it wasn't just to Gary, it was during Gary's talk, it just occurred to me, but also to all the others really, whether there's this huge push across all systems to have more connectivity, but even from a human perspective, the recent pandemic shows the dangers in terms of disease of too much connectivity, and it's probably the same with invasive species. So with this push towards more connectivity of all our natural systems, is that a risk that we're actually opening up our natural systems to increased risks of disease or being overtaken by invasive species? So should we actually be keeping some good quality habitat patches as disconnected as possible to actually act as refugia against those threats?
Well, Justin, I know you know too much. So first of all, there are a lot of, in answering this question, besides the panelists, there are some people on this call who actually can answer that question very well. But let me first point out, a lot of people get connectivity confused from introductions. And introductions is a completely human created situation that connect our natural connectivity, then these introductions then facilitate these dysfunctions that come with that. And we have to stop the introductions. And there's a whole invasive species strategies that are, and biosecurity strategies that are set up to stop this introduction process. They don't always work, but it's there. The next thing I also always have to tell folks is that a lot of the ills we see with connectivity are the reflection of fragmentation. You think it's connectivity, but it's actually fragmentation. For instance, when we see diseases coming into places or loss of genetic continuity, it's because what we have done is we fragmented spots and then we reconnected them. And in the reconnection process, this new equilibrium has created. And anyone who does disease modeling with SIR knows that, when you create these new patch conditions and then you reconnect them, then you have these then connectivity creates this kind of pathology or injury that we see. Finally, with invasives in, following connectivity, a lot of times if you have ecological integrity, invasives should not move very well. Basically, you have the natural habitat that should create a buffer to the invasive process, but that's not always the case because people tend to mess up the integrity of landscapes, and hence we have these invasions. In general, the amount of ill that connectivity does is very poor if you really look at the root cause that's driving the process. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but I think if you're doing connectivity planning, you have to, you have to do an assessment of these potential side effects, but they're very, very minor. It's certainly not what George Hess wrote about in conservation biology as this fear of connectivity spreading disease and ills that we've ever seen, because the overwhelming evidence since says connectivity is good in most conditions and in most places. Any others want to comment?
Do any of the other panelists want to come in on that one?
I was actually going to say that I kind of agree with Gary. I've not read about it nearly as much, nor studied it as much. But from a local scale, certainly in Somerset, if you actually look at the ecological network maps, the reality is that the areas in which we are going to be trying to connect habitats that are similar or the same are very localized anyway. So for example, we would be looking at on Exmoor to connect patches of heathland to each other within what's probably a few square kilometers. Likewise on the Mendip Hills, where we're looking at recreating limestone grassland networks, we're looking at a few square kilometers. So it's not that we creating massive networks where suddenly huge disconnected populations are going to come in contact with each other. These are very localized areas where species that may only have been separated for a relatively short period of time will come into contact with each other. However, I do agree that in some places, especially some like the Somerset Levels and Moors, the Avalon Marshes landscape that Simon was talking about, there is a real risk that things like invasive species will be a problem, because we know for a fact that there are a number of invasive plants in that area that if we start connecting things up and taking away the blockages, we may see an increase in occurrence. But that is just one of those risks that we have to try and think about when we're developing a project to start connecting up the landscape.
Definitely brilliant. And I think that really, it links actually with a question that's just come in from Barbara Canero. And we had previously also a question from Paul de Ornelas around sort of that local stakeholder community involvement. Paul's question was more around actually how do we get communities involved with that? But I wanted actually, Barbara, whether you wanted to ask your question about citizen science, and perhaps to Anne, because being a monitoring officer and citizen science being such a potential game changer, certainly with technology. Barbara, are you still with us?
Yes, hi.
Hi.
Yeah, I was wondering if citizen science could be as I wrote, a powerful tool to help increase the connectivity and also raise awareness for the importance of it.
Absolutely. The Wildlife Trusts work with local communities on a huge scale. A large part of, for example, our Mendip Hills Living Landscape, a huge part of that is about connecting communities and actually enabling local groups to work to create those connectivity, those corridors or those stepping stones. A huge part of our strategy is about trying to get people connected with wildlife. And that might be that they are fundraising for us, for example, or for another charity. They might be actually doing on-the-ground conservation volunteering work. We have a huge number of volunteers, both working on our own site and on working on community sites. We have a huge network of what we call specialist groups who are managed through the Somerset Environmental Record Centre, but we have huge connections with. They do monitoring. So we've got, for example, the Somerset Botany Group, we've got the Reptile and Amphibian Group, we've got the Otter Group, the Mammal Group, loads of different groups. And they're all out there on our reserve and elsewhere in the county, monitoring, collecting data, and actually delivering conservation work on the ground. So it's hugely important, and we absolutely understand that importance.
I was just going to, if you don't mind, just quickly add to that, that I think, you know, the connectivity in terms of actually connecting people with the natural environment, citizen science is a huge opportunity to do that, particularly with modern technology and how easy it is for people to record things on devices and things. I mean, a really good example is something that the trusts have just launched in the last week, which is about people actually downloading an app on their computer, on their phone, and a special thing that they can actually go and monitor. Sounds very horrible, but actually monitor insects on their number plates. So we can actually get an idea of how insect populations are doing across the country. And it's a really good example of how you just get everybody engaged. Because I think one of the issues that we do face, and Anne's talked about the fantastic groups and volunteers that we do have that are involved with citizen science, but not enough people are involved, and we need to get more people involved with actually monitoring what's on their doorstep and becoming more connected with nature at their local level.
Brilliant, thank you. And Marcelo, you wanted to come in there as well.
Yes, I'd just like to add that, I mean, one of the major bottlenecks about connectivity conservation is exactly monitoring if it's working or not. So obviously citizen science is vital for that process. It's much more developed, I guess, in places like the UK or Europe or maybe the US, less so in Brazil, I'd say. But it's really interesting. And the other thing to think about is participatory biodiversity monitoring, which is basically a kind of citizen science where local people, local as in that they live in the area, river dwellers, indigenous people, can also help monitor the biodiversity. And what we need also is more of a kind of a protocol that we can use so everybody can share information, and we're confident that that information is robust. So that's very, very important. Participation of citizens, absolutely.
Certainly, and I think that involvement of Indigenous communities is something that's often done in international conservation, and we're not actually quite so good at doing that in the UK conservation. I think we've started to get a little bit better about it. Oh, it's my phone going, so annoying. I haven't had a phone for 2 years, and suddenly I get one and it goes off in the middle of this. I just wonder if we might stick with the theme of monitoring, because we've been talking about that kind of monitoring, but Richard had a question about how do we measure connectivity objectively, and then Sinead came in with a question about habitats and species. I'm just going to deal with my phone. Okay.
Who was that directed at?
So I wonder actually when we talk about how do we measure connectivity objectively, I wonder if that's either back to Gary, because I'm saving Humphrey for a question just now. It's back to Gary potentially, and then Humphrey.
Oh darn, you don't have to save Humphrey. Okay, well the issue is that connectivity is what is the value you're measuring? Whether whether it was connectivity or protected area or key biodiversity area, you have set a criteria for what you're going to measure, what you value. Same thing for connectivity. So what's the element you're going to measure? You're going to measure habitat, structural, species, stream flows. What is it you value? Like in the state of Washington, what they did is they worked on what they call focal species, and they picked 16 focal species that had different various needs. And they figured if they had this assemblage and they could deal with the connectivity needs of these 16 species, they got most of the majority of the ecological connectivity that would be sustained for the state of Washington. That was their approach. That's how they approached it. It will differ. The freshwater people have a whole different set of indices. They really do. If you look at Grill's paper, I think it is in Nature, they have a wonderful set of indices that they focus on measuring for freshwater aquatic connectivity. So that's how I would answer that.
Brilliant. Humphrey, do you want to chip in there, or are we saving you for the next question?
I was just going to say, I think it's a little bit of a Wild West frontier, actually, in terms of of measuring connectivity. And I quite like a comment that Mark Hewell-White gave in a talk from University of Montana. He said structural connectivity is hypothetical connectivity based on biophysical habitat, and functional connectivity is real connectivity based on what animals really do. So you can measure things like, I don't know, amounts of hedgerows, or whether two pieces of woodland are joined together with a strip of woodland. But it's whether the animals or plants are actually using them is much more difficult. But there are ways of potentially measuring this using genetic markers, potentially, to see whether the populations are actually connected by showing some sort of gene flow. But that may become more possible, and also could be done using citizen science, potentially, if you had people collecting material to be analyzed relatively quickly using new DNA techniques. So that's sort of a slightly wild suggestion.
Brilliant, thank you. Sorry, Gary, did you want to come back?
Well, I just want to come back. It's just that, this is like the Holy Grail. Functional connectivity is like there's something you search for, and you hope you get to it, and it's brilliant. And so many of my ecological friends focus on this, but it's sometimes very, very hard. And the reality is that sometimes we're left with structural connectivity. But what I have found is that it's not that far off. I mean, give structural connectivity a chance, because species can adapt. Species have behaviors. We don't count for those things, as we just assume that one species and its movement reflects connectivity, but there's so much more. So I want us to balance the structural functional. Don't get into this specious debate about connectivity, because it really hinders our approach to move forward.
I think so much of this is a build it and they will come. It's not for everything. And I think so often we look at species in the last fragments of their habitat, and we think that's what they need, and we build some great thing for them, and actually they would be quite happy in all sorts of other things. So yes, definitely agree with the kind of let's get on with it. And speaking of let's get on with it, we've got Rob Stoneman, who is the new Director of Landscape Connectivity. I've probably got that title totally wrong, in the Wildlife Trust. Who's kind of asked the question about scale. Rob, do you want to come in here? And Humphrey, I'm sure particularly be delighted to answer it.
Thanks, Pamela. Yeah, no, I mean, very taken by your presentation, Humphrey, and thinking about trophic complexity as part of that bigger, better mix. So if we want complex, messy, and dynamic ecosystems, we need to have high levels of trophic complexity, and especially of the big keystone species. So we can think in the UK, you know, we've particularly lost some of those big herbivore species, and of course big predator species, much more difficult to reintroduce. But it would be fantastic if we could set our ambition around a series of really big protected areas that are managed for wildlife, where we could allow, you know, wild cattle, wild horse proxies in particular to range. So, I mean, we need to think about protected areas that are well over 100 hectares. I mean, probably talking about 1,000 hectares or 2,000 hectares or 3,000 hectares. And I'm just wondering how unrealistic is that, and whether we should actually be, if we really want to recover nature in this country in the way that the 25-year plan wants us to, then, you know, should we start to raise our ambition a bit higher?
I couldn't agree with you more. And in fact, your question prompted me to realize I'd forgotten to mention something which I'd meant to mention during my talk. So yes, I do think we should be looking at bigger areas. The 25-year environment plan talks about 25 nature recovery areas, which are meant to be big. I was asked how big these should be, and the trouble is, you know, how big should a site be is quite a difficult question. Eventually, I came up with the suggestion that we should be talking about between 5,000 and 13,000 hectares, 5,000 at least, because that fits nicely with the core areas that are used of parts of biosphere reserves in Europe. Not the gigantic ones you might get in Russia and so on, but most biosphere reserves have a core area on average about 5,000 to 13,000 hectares. So I think 5,000 hectares is what we should be going for. Actually, I keep on pushing for this quite a lot within Natural England, and I think there's a possibility that we may get, we will get some of these areas which would allow exactly all those processes to happen. And that would be really exciting. It would have, I think, huge economic benefits, and would allow us to have, you know, things like bison coming in. Maybe we should be having moose in here as well, and it would be great to have lynx. I think lynx won't be too far away with any luck. We're going to have white-tailed seagulls soon in various places. So. Yes, no, I agree entirely. We should be more ambitious. I think the government has the appetite to be ambitious. So I think, you know, keep fingers crossed and keep pressure up, because it would be fantastic. And I think it's the only way we're going to get our biodiversity back as well.
Brilliant. Marcelo, you wanted to come in as well. Was that on an answer to that question?
Yeah, yes, it is. It is regarding that question. I think, Humphrey, that obviously having bigger protected areas in the UK is brilliant, but you have to elevate the protected area status. So you have to stop having category 4 national parks or something like IUCN category 4 or 5, and you really have to have something like category 2, category 1, and that will make the actual difference. Otherwise, it's just, you know, countryside that, you know, you've got some access and walking around and that kind of thing. So I mean, coming from a mega diverse country and where, you know, our protected areas are enormous, we have to have bigger, but I understand that this is an island and we don't have that much natural habitat left, but we really need to protect it.
Yeah. Oh, I was going to come back very quickly just to say, I think. Yeah, I think the national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty, which are our landscape designations, which are big, are really getting geared up to get more involved in making more of our land really good for biodiversity. So I think there's some positive moves there, but we will need to think about expanding outside there into some of the white space in our sort of protected area networks, because that's we need some decent chunks of habitat in those areas too.
So I think this comes on really, really nicely to something which we held in Norfolk Wildlife Trust, a Rewilding Norfolk seminar for 50 farmers. And a lot of the fear there was that if they create something amazing by whatever means, rewilding, regenerating, countryside stewardship, somebody would come along and slap a designation on it, and then they kind of it kept it as it was, and Dave Richard, you had a question about this, and I wondered if you wanted to ask that.
Thanks, yes. Well, it was prompted by Humphrey's presentation, and thank you very much for that. One of the benefits of connectivity is a sort of scale factor of letting natural systems behave more in the way that they want. And I was attracted by what you said about looking for ways of facilitating ecological dynamism in these systems of areas. But at least in the UK, we're a bit stuck with this sort of regime of policy and law that has been critiqued as sort of fossilizing the protected areas, for example, that we have, sometimes in the wrong places, sometimes trying to preserve something that isn't the way the natural systems want to work. But any hint of allowing more dynamism in that gets seized upon immediately by opposing interests who see it as a relaxing of the protections that have been put in place. And so my question was really about how you navigate a way forward in policy and law to facilitate that very necessary, I think, ecological dynamism that you spoke of, without opening the floodgates to a lot of appeals by opposing interests.
Brilliant. Who would like to come in on that? Or
well, I didn't want to sort of dominate the answers, as it were. So I don't know. Does Anne or Simon have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, Simon. I was saving Simon for the next one, but Simon, I think you can go to this one too.
I mean, I actually think that that we need to. I mean, I'll look at it from a Somerset context. One of the things in our new strategy is that we are very aware of the importance of our current nature reserves in terms of their importance, as they're actually the places where we have the rarer species. We have those habitats that have been damaged elsewhere, and that it's incredibly important that we retain those as almost like the I'm going to use what a frame that Anne was talking about the other day, the jewels in the crown of what we have in the county. And they're really, really important that we can keep those going for the time being, because they are the places where nature is hanging on. I think the opportunities in a county like Somerset, for example, 74% of the county is a farm landscape that's, and there are lots of what we've described as the white zones, those white areas, those landscapes where actually, if we can reward the landowners and the farmers by new mechanisms to manage that land in a more naturalized system, working with nature rather than perhaps working against nature, you can then start to create habitats. You can start to create connectivity. You can allow species to move out from the core sites. I think over time you can then start to, as you were describing there, step back a little bit and maybe not be as concerned about the existing protected sites. You can then start to look at them in a more dynamic way. I think we've got to be really careful. We don't, I use another phrase, throw the baby out with the bathwater at this stage. I suppose that's where I come from at a local Somerset level.
I think I would completely agree with everything Simon said, obviously. From my own perspective, my own personal perspective, I draw up some of the management plans for our reserves. And one of the huge frustrations for me is where we've got reserves that have got spatial mosaics, we can't move those mosaics. We want to have grassland in the middle of a woodland that's got a little bit of a wetland connected to it. But we have to keep those forever in perpetuity in their current positions. But actually the reality is, if we could say, we will keep X proportion of this site in this state and X proportion, we are really struggling with it being able to be just that very little bit more flexible. But equally, I understand how important it is to retain those really good parts of the network as we then spread out into the wider landscape and try to buffer those sites much more. And once we've got bigger buffer zones, that may be something we can consider. And certainly from a Wildlife Trust perspective, things that we propose, like the wild belts, new designations, conservation covenants, where you work in partnership with an NGO, for example, so where a landowner puts their land into a covenant with an organization, but you can then build those agreement to be less prescriptive and more flexible to allow different spatial mosaics, temporal mosaics to start to form.
Brilliant, thank you. And then Daniel had a kind of question that speaks across all of this, which is about, you know, how do you decide where these go? I don't know, Dan, if you wanted to expand on that particular aspect of it, because I know there was some sort of ferocious competition between people the last time Natural England popped up some funding for doing exciting things over large areas, and lots of coalitions of the willing that could have been built just weren't successful in bidding for funding. So you had a question, Daniel.
Hi, hello, yeah, Daniel, University of Middlesex and Middlesex Wildlife Trust. I think my question is probably a bit broad and some of it's been answered, but I'm just interested in your opinions on where the big gaps in knowledge and bottlenecks are. And is it your opinion, is it where wildlife corridors should go? Is it monitoring, or is it dealing with landowners? Which are the biggest sort of, I suppose, research questions where more information is needed in order to reach your goals?
Gary.
Well, a couple things to keep in mind. The pace of fragmentation is unprecedented. You look around the world, how much land clearing there was right before COVID, and it's staggering. And why connectivity is rising in the ranks is because what do we have to protect conservation outside of protected areas before we have these isolated islands? So we have one research question is the pace of climate change, the velocity of climate change as it relates to the pace of fragmentation. The second element is that a lot of the protected areas aren't protecting the most high biodiversity values in the world. And while we make a case for creating ecological networks that connect protected areas, we haven't protected the right spots in the right places for that connectivity to work. So we also have to look at, hey, what's the disconnection here? Let's look at those areas of high biodiversity values that have not been protected, that need to be connected, and where does that add up in terms of our biological or biodiversity estate?
Thank you, Humphrey. Did I see your hand up? Oh, and Marcelo as well. Do you want to follow on from that?
Yeah, yes, just briefly, I think, oh God, I've forgotten what I was going to say now. I'll pass over to Marcelo.
Marcelo.
Yeah, right. So one of the gaps that we identified back when I was doing work at WCMC was the actual lack of policies in the world. So we have a lot of methodology, we have a lot of tools, we have thousands of work, either theoretical or in the lab or in situ, about connectivity. But then when it comes to the government aspect, you don't have the policies in place to actually establish these connectivity elements. And even sometimes when you do, for example, in Brazil, we have some of that. There has to be the willingness to do that, to implement that. So that is really a big gap, is having policies in place and the willingness to establish these connectivity areas and, for example, include the monitoring process that is needed.
Brilliant, thank you. And Humphrey, have you remembered?
I have remembered, yeah, I think I think there are two.
Time, hasn't it? We've been going for an hour and 3/4 without a break. All participants as well.
So I forgot to bring a pen up into this room where I am, so I can't write down my thoughts. Yeah, I think social science actually is a really big issue. So particularly in UK, we rely so much on farmers and other landowners to help us do everything. And we don't know really how they think or what motivates them, who, you know, all that sort of stuff. So the social science aspect, particularly with connectivity, explaining or getting, it may be that they get it completely easily, but we just don't know, to be honest. So I think that's a huge gap. I think the other gap is actually to talk about what Gary was talking about earlier, structural connectivity. Yeah, I mean, that's the way we're going to have to go, because that's all we can see, as it were. But understanding more about functional connectivity is a really big area that we do need to know more about. So I think those are two big evidence gap areas.
Definitely, and that's partly why when we ran our workshop, it was actually landowner to landowner, farmer to farmer, so they could ask all sorts of questions that actually we wouldn't be able to answer as conservationists. But you know, we had a different skill set, so I think that's great. Mike, have you got your hand up to ask a particular, Mike Pinkowski, have you got to ask a particular to join this little debate, or is it a general question?
Yeah, it was really related to this. I mean, what I'm a bit concerned about when we're talking about which method is better, which other method, is we actually need to use all the tools we can get here. I mean, thinking back to when I was active in UK conservation, which is, you know, a few years back now, in the 80s and 90s, we were very concerned this idea, and we used to make a joke with our Dutch colleagues that they can only see things as being either protected or unprotected, and there are lots of stages in between which we can use. If you're just going for total rewilding approaches, you might find yourself stuck to say, okay, let's go for the uplands, we can't do anything with the lowlands. But if we'd done that, we would never have started the Red Kite project, because we recognize we've got to do something which can try and address some of these areas in lowland Britain where we think there's a chance of getting something right. So it's a plea to use all the tools we've got. Okay, individual people will focus on different approaches, but in a landscape where it's not state-owned for the most part, it's individually owned, then we've got to try and use the opportunities we can to influence those owners to do a range of things which might add up. Thanks so much.
Thank you, that's great. And I've just, so we've got around just under 10 minutes to go. We've got a couple of questions around relating to funding. But first of all, I just wondered, because we've been very, very terrestrial really, whether Annika might like to ask her question going beyond the land. If you're still, Annika, here, Annika Clements.
I am still here.
Fantastic.
Welcome. Yes. I guess that's the thing, and going back to the very first presentation by Gary, you know, it is a principle that can be extended into air, you know, freshwater, terrestrial and marine. But at the moment, just speaking from the limited amount of research that I've done, I've not seen many examples of where it's been applied, even in intertidal zone, but let alone the kind of subtidal zone. And there's that danger again where everything stops at a certain line. And that's not great for connectivity either, particularly when we recognize the intertidal in particular is going to be an area of very marked change with climate change. I'm very new to the nature recovery networks idea, although ecological connectivity certainly has been around for as long as I've been an adult, basically, which is quite a while. But it's something I would love to hear more. Are there any examples where, you know, they've sort of cross that boundary, or is everything being done in its silos again, and the marine environment being siloed separately from the terrestrial environment?
So I wonder if we might start with Gary, unless anyone else is making a bid for here.
Well, first of all, you want a case study. The California Coastal Conservancy has a great case study on this coastal connectivity with the Channel Islands off of California at the back of the IUCN Guidelines. It's a great case study looking at the kelp forest as it relates to coastal environments. The other element is that the marine world is moving very fast on connectivity, and while there's been so much emphasis on marine protected areas, now there's a whole community of folks who are doing marine connectivity. And we have a subgroup within the Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group, about 100 folks who are working on marine connectivity. As I alluded to in my introductory remarks, is that they have the water column to deal with besides the two-dimension that terrestrial people just tend to focus on, even though treetops is our limits. And I can get information about the Connectivity Specialist Group to link up. As far as the structural issues between the marine and terrestrial folks, send help. It's one of my, and the freshwater people, it is one of the banes of my existence that these folks have really kind of carved up the world and see it in different ways. And when we talk about transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary conservation, we really have to look within our own ranks.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think we haven't had time to put everybody's questions, and I know we've been having some fantastically useful links in the chat, and Chris, will we be able to send people these links? Are we able to do that? Brilliant, especially thanks to Catherine Dugan, who's been doing a fantastic job in putting things in all the time, which is lovely, and the rest of you. Some of the questions people have been answering all along, and there was a fascinating question on the ecology of fear, which we haven't quite got time for, but I did see some interesting debate on it. I kind of might like to finish. There was a question from Gina around funding relating to the churchyard scheme, but I wanted to actually just broaden it out, and maybe we might be able to answer that in the hinterland of this as well, because there's a kind of, well, this is all very well, but actually who's going to pay for it? And we know there are various different funding streams that are coming along. They were mentioned in Simon and Anne's presentation. They've been mentioned by Humphrey and Marcelo in the business link as well. But, Julian Bransom, I don't know if you want to ask your question, checking you're still here. Rather nicely kind of put as a summary final question, if you are still here.
Yes, I am, thanks. It's Julian Branscombe, Cornwall Wildlife Trust. I'm just keen that we focus on enough about practice and pragmatic opportunity. And I think that there's an awful lot of theory and policy discussion and not enough acceptance, or at least not in what we've been saying. There's not been enough acceptance about how we go from where we are now to where we need to be, because it's such an enormous change. And I'm just very keen to have contributions from anyone as to how they think we can achieve the resourcing and societal groundswell to make that enormous change.
Brilliant. And I wonder actually if we might, it seems like a sort of natural England question, but I actually just wondered if there was a perspective from the other wildlife trusts on this as well. So if we started with Simon or Anne and then move on to Humphrey.
I think resourcing is a huge issue, and you know, some of the projects that we're doing in Somerset, resourcing is an issue. The Wilds of Churches project, for example, that is funded through through funding which we're receiving from existing project work. So it's something that we've been able to kind of tag on to existing projects. Our work with the local nature partnership, we've had to get resources from the local nature partnership to drive it. So we've had contributions from the statutory bodies, we've had contributions from the local authorities and some of those sort of private companies that are involved. So we're bringing in the resources to drive the work, but I think resourcing is a huge issue. And also the pots of money that are coming down the line aren't huge, and there's a lot of competition for them. So for example, the Green Recovery Fund, that, you know, I've been involved a lot in trying to put together really complicated funding bids in very short timescales. We do need to find a better way of resourcing this work. It's, you know, a fraction of what is needed is coming down the way. There are new funding mechanisms coming along, things like we've talked about biodiversity net gain, and also payments for public goods, so things around carbon and around, for example, nutrient mitigation, so phosphates and nitrates, for example, but they're not enough. So yeah, I don't know what the answer is to it, but I would say that we're really struggling with resourcing. We need more money to do it. We don't need huge amounts because we can do a lot with a little bit of money, but it's an issue. Yeah.
Can I just say, a lot of the work that we actually talked about, that I talked about particularly in our talk, a lot of that was resourced through that 10-year Section 106 agreement. Huge amounts of money over a long period of time, which is almost unheard of, even, you know, within the Wildlife Trust as an organisation. So we consider ourselves to be very fortunate that we've been able to get to this position, but I have genuine sympathy for other wildlife trusts who aren't yet at the same position that we are in, who are having to try to do this because there isn't that sort of local funding resource to actually develop, you know, these mechanisms, these maps, these nature recovery networks. So yeah, it's really difficult, but it's one of those things that once we got that funding pot, we've been able to tag so many different funds onto it because we've started with that one project, and because we have that continuity of officers and time and people, projects, connections. Because you have that connectivity, you can start to bring more money in, but it's really hard when you're just starting off.
Fantastic. And Humphrey is the person with the golden pot of money for nature restoration in Natural England. Did you want to come in and tell us where it all is and how we can get it?
Yeah, I thought people should just write in and ask me, and I'll send them the cash. You know, check.
That just seemed to be a brilliant solution. And given we probably have about 30 seconds left.
I was going to say local nature recovery strategies are, which should be organised as part of the way of building up the nature recovery network nationally, will be organised by probably the local authorities in each area, but they will provide the catalyst, I think, at a local level for bringing the money in. I think net gain is important. The new environmental land management scheme will also be important for helping to support a lot of this, but it is a big issue, and I hope the government does produce more money to do it as well. He says off the record. Oh dear, this is recorded, isn't it?
That feels like it's 6 o'clock. That feels really like a perfect place to stop. The chat has been amazing. Thank you to everyone who's participated in the chat. Thank you to everyone who has asked questions, and apologies to those who haven't managed to have them answered out loud. Thank you hugely to the IUCN UK committee and Chris Mann for hosting, to Marcelo, to Humphrey, to Anne, to Simon, and to Gary for speaking. And it sounds like we potentially might have another one, and maybe potentially with a few breakout groups in a kind of connectivity to have more of a conversation. It felt like there were more conversations that we could have all had with each other, and perhaps that's what we might do next time. So do write in with your ideas, and thank you all very much for an astoundingly brilliant session. Thank you. That awkward thing of now we're all kind of just going bye-bye, finding the bye-bye buttons. Bye-bye, everyone.